Welcome to Restful Tales, your doorway to peaceful dreams. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to keep the stories alive. Sweet dreams await. Let's begin the story. Ethan's life had been solitary since the death of his mother. She was the last family he had left, the only constant in his otherwise lonely world. After her passing, Ethan had no choice but to return to Harper's Creek, the town he had grown up in. The small, sleepy town, perched against the edge of a forested hill, seemed like the kind of place where time slowed down. Everything there felt still, like the air was always heavy, weighed down by the fog that clung to the trees during the early mornings. Returning to the town, however, wasn't about nostalgia. It wasn't about returning to the memories of a better time. No, it was about silence, about escape. Ethan had always been an introvert, someone who kept to himself, and the death of his mother only deepened the sense of isolation that had always been his companion. Her passing was like a slow, suffocating descent into something darker, deeper, a world without color. His apartment, small and dreary, sat above the Harper's Creek Library. It was fitting, he thought. The library had always been a sanctuary for his mother, and now it would serve as a refuge for him. It was a place of stillness, of dusty books and forgotten memories, a place where the past lingered in the corners, in the pages of old novels, in the faded spines of well-worn tomes. On his first day at the library, Ethan wandered the quiet halls, adjusting to the faint smell of mildew and the echoing silence. The librarians, an elderly couple, hardly noticed his presence. They were as quiet as the building itself. The building had a long history, a haunted history, filled with stories of generations past. Some of those stories, Ethan knew, had been hidden away, locked in the archives in the basement, beneath layers of dust and age-old cobwebs. It was while he was going through some old donation boxes in the basement that he found the box, tucked in the far corner, beneath a stack of newspapers and some unwanted furniture. The box caught his eye. It was a plain cardboard box, unmarked, and yet there was something about it that seemed different. The kind of difference that sent a shiver down his spine, something he couldn't quite explain. He pulled it out from the shadows and set it on the floor in front of him. Inside the box were more than a dozen old VHS tapes. Each one was carefully labeled, though the handwriting was strange, erratic, almost frantic. Some titles read like riddles: The Watcher, The Door, The Key, The Silent Room. No names, no dates, just those cryptic words. Ethan hesitated. The library had thousands of tapes, some old, some newer, but these were unlike anything he'd ever seen. Curiosity got the better of him, and with a mixture of unease and intrigue, he decided to take them home. That evening, he sat in the dim light of his apartment, the wind howling outside. The room was still except for the hum of the old VCR as it clicked on. Ethan placed the first tape into the machine. As the screen flickered to life, a chill ran down his spine. He couldn't explain it, but something about the tape felt wrong. The first image that appeared on the screen was a living room, dark and dilapidated. There were no signs of life. The room was empty save for a single man sitting in a chair. His back was rigid, his posture unnaturally straight, and though his face was cast in shadow, Ethan felt as though the man was staring directly at him. His eyes were cold, unblinking. The room was still, too still. No movement, no sounds, only the soft hum of the VCR. Then, out of the corner of the frame, Ethan saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, like a shadow passing behind the man. But as the seconds dragged on, the shadow became more distinct. A figure, tall, dark, and humanoid. lurking at the edge of the room. The figure didn't belong there. Ethan could feel his pulse quicken, his breath caught in his throat. The figure was out of place, its outline blurred, shifting. He leaned forward, his eyes glued to the screen, as the figure slowly crept closer to the man in the chair. And then nothing. The tape abruptly cut to static, and the screen went black. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He ejected the tape, his hands trembling. He stared at it for several long moments, unsure of what to think of what he had just witnessed. It didn't make sense. His mind raced with questions, doubts. Was it some kind of prank? A recording? A trick? But something inside him told him it wasn't. His curiosity was too strong. Despite the unease that clung to him like a second skin, Ethan inserted the next tape. The image on the screen flickered and stabilized. This time, the setting was different. A dark hallway, lit only by a faint, flickering light from an overhead lamp. A door was at the end of the hallway, but there was no one visible. The camera focused on the door, as if it were waiting for something to happen. Ethan felt the air grow colder as the seconds stretched on. The tension was unbearable. The silence, broken only by the hum of the VCR, seemed to press down on him. And then, from behind the door, a faint tapping noise began. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan's heart raced. He could hear the tapping, but the door remained closed. The figure behind it remained unseen. He wanted to stop the tape, wanted to turn away, but something in him, something dark, kept him watching. Suddenly, the door creaked open. What came next, Ethan could hardly describe. The door creaked open with an eerie, groaning sound that seemed to echo through the silence of the room. Ethan leaned in, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. His eyes were fixed on the screen, watching with a mixture of dread and fascination. The hallway was still, but something about the air around him felt heavier. It was as if the room itself had grown colder, the darkness stretching beyond the frame of the television, creeping into his small apartment. Nothing moved at first. The door was open, but no one came through. The only sound was the faint, distant hum of the VCR, a soft, mechanical whir that seemed to distort the silence even further. And then the tapping began again, louder this time, more frantic. It reverberated against the walls of the hallway, a rhythmic, maddening sound that felt almost deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The sound seemed to reverberate in his ears, pulsing through his body. Each tap was a step closer, each one drawing him further into the dark mystery of the room beyond the door. But still, no one came. The camera remained fixed on the door, unmoving, as if waiting for something to happen. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tapping stopped. Ethan blinked. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with anticipation. His pulse was racing now, his hands clammy, as if he could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The door was still ajar, and the hallway was empty. But in the darkness beyond, something seemed to stir. He could see it now, the faintest shift in the shadows, a subtle movement at the edge of the frame. It was brief, barely perceptible, but there was something there, something moving. It wasn't human, though. The shape was too fluid, too unnatural. It seemed to slip in and out of focus, flickering like an unstable mirage. Ethan's breath quickened. He felt a growing sense of unease, a pull toward the unknown, as if the room beyond the door were calling him. There was no rational explanation for it. He knew that, but in the pit of his stomach, Something told him that he was witnessing something that shouldn't be seen, something that couldn't be seen. And yet, the longer he stared at the screen, the more he felt drawn in. It was as if the room on the tape was pulling him, as if he were being trapped in its web of silence and shadow. The figure in the hallway began to move, slowly, deliberately, its shape flickering in and out of focus. Ethan watched, unable to look away, as the figure seemed to drift toward the door. It moved with a strange, unnatural grace, its limbs elongated and disjointed, like a marionette on invisible strings. And then it stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The figure stood just inside the doorway, its head tilted at an odd angle, staring directly at the camera. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were black voids, empty and soulless, staring into Ethan with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. He felt it then, the overwhelming sense of being watched, not just by the figure on the screen, but by something else, something outside the frame, something that had been lurking just beyond his reach, waiting for him to notice it. The figure moved again, stepping fully into the doorway. As it did, a low, guttural whisper filled the room, seeping through the television like a murmur in the dark. It was barely audible, but it was unmistakable. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was distorted, as though it were coming from underwater, or perhaps from the depths of the earth itself. It reverberated in the pit of Ethan's stomach, a deep, resonating sound that felt like it was clawing at his insides. The figure stepped closer to the camera, its limbs twisting in impossible angles, and Ethan felt his pulse race. He reached for the remote, but his hands shook so violently that he almost dropped it. His mind screamed at him to turn the tape off, to stop this madness, but his body refused to obey. He couldn't tear his eyes away. The figure reached the camera's lens, its distorted face looming closer, and the screen suddenly went black. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his hands still gripping the remote, but he couldn't move. The silence in the apartment was absolute. He felt like he was suffocating, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. His fingers trembled as he rewound the tape, his mind racing. He watched the scene play out again, just as before, but this time, the figure in the doorway lingered longer, its eyes burning through the screen. And this time, as the figure stepped forward, Ethan saw something else. A small, subtle detail that he had missed the first time. A shadow behind the figure. At first, it seemed like an optical illusion, but as the figure moved, it became clear. The shadow wasn't just a shadow, it was something else. Something alive. Ethan's heart pounded as he watched the shadow stretch and twist, taking on a shape that was almost human, but not quite. It writhed like a thing made of liquid darkness, undulating and shifting, as though it were trying to break free of the confines of the room. He ejected the tape in a panic, the plastic clattering against the VCR. He stared at it for a long time, his mind reeling. What had he just seen? What was that thing? And why did it feel like it was waiting for him? His thoughts were a whirlwind, and the more he tried to calm himself, the more his mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about the tapes, the strange messages, the figure in the doorway. He had to watch them all. He had to know. But as the night wore on, the unease grew. The silence in his apartment felt heavier now, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting in the corners of the room, and the whispers, faint, unintelligible whispers, began again, as though something was speaking just outside his hearing. Ethan knew deep down that he should stop, that he should throw the tapes away, get rid of them, and leave Harper's Creek behind. But there was a pull, a compulsion that kept him watching, kept him coming back to the VCR again and again. And as the hours passed, his obsession grew. The tapes became his world, and the shadows in the corners of his apartment became his constant companions. He could feel them watching him, could hear their voices in his mind, whispering to him in the darkness. The days bled into one another, indistinguishable from each other. Ethan's sense of time had begun to blur. He barely noticed the passage of hours, weeks, or days as he sunk deeper into his obsession with the tapes. Each new tape he watched only raised more questions, but with those questions came an undeniable pull, a desire to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. The figure in the hallway, the figure with the empty eyes, had become an omnipresent thought. It lingered in his mind, its distorted face appearing whenever he closed his eyes, its voice echoing through the quiet of his apartment. "You shouldn't be here." It was as though the figure had spoken directly to him, as if it had known he would watch, known he would be unable to stop. But why? Why was he drawn to these tapes? Why was he so compelled to watch, to delve deeper into something that could only be described as wrong? He began watching the tapes during the day, just to avoid the increasing fear that gripped him at night. The sunlight, faint as it was in his dim apartment, offered a brief reprieve, a way to distance himself from the dark pull of the tapes. But even in the light, the unease never fully dissipated. The shadows still moved in the corners of his room. The whispering, quiet and insistent, seemed to grow louder the longer he stayed in the apartment. Each night, after watching a new tape, Ethan would find himself unable to sleep. The images, those fleeting, terrifying glimpses of something that couldn't be real, kept playing in his mind. He saw the figure from the hallway again, and then he saw something worse. One of the tapes revealed a room, an abandoned house, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. A small child sat in the center of the room, rocking back and forth, muttering to themselves. The camera zoomed in on the child's face, revealing their empty, hollow eyes. But it wasn't the child that terrified him. It was the thing behind them. A figure, tall and distorted, with limbs that twisted in unnatural ways, hovered in the shadows behind the child. It stood perfectly still, like a predator waiting for its prey to make a move. Ethan's breath quickened as he watched the figure slowly step forward, its distorted form growing clearer with each passing second. The child didn't seem to notice the figure. They were lost in their own world, mumbling something in a language that Ethan couldn't understand. And then the figure's hand reached out, impossibly long, impossibly thin. And as the hand hovered over the child's head, the screen abruptly cut to black. Ethan sat frozen in his chair, staring at the blank screen. The room felt colder. The shadows seemed to press closer against the walls. The whispering, those soft, unintelligible murmurs, had started again, this time louder, more distinct. Ethan could feel the words crawling under his skin, even though he couldn't make them out. "You shouldn't be here." The voice wasn't coming from the television anymore. It was coming from everywhere. The room felt suffocating now. His chest tightened, and his head swam with dizziness. He got up, shaking, and stumbled toward the window, pulling the curtain open just slightly to peer outside. The streets of Harper's Creek were still empty. The fog rolled in from the forest, curling around the lamp posts like fingers reaching for him. He closed the curtain and backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. The oppressive silence of the town was unbearable. He felt like he was being watched, like the very air around him had become alive with unseen eyes. There was a knocking at the door. At first, it was light, almost imperceptible, like the tapping from the tape. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted toward the door, his heart thudding against his ribs. He hadn't expected anyone. He wasn't expecting anyone. The knocking grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan's legs felt weak, as though the very ground beneath him was shifting, sliding away. The knocking grew louder still, each tap a jagged beat in the symphony of terror that was unfolding around him. The walls seemed to close in, the room growing darker with every passing moment. The shadows seemed to take on new, sinister forms, twisting and writhing against the corners of the walls, as if alive, aware of his fear. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The knocking stopped. For a brief moment, everything was still. And then, as if summoned by his own thoughts, the door creaked open, just a few inches. The air grew colder. The shadows deepened. Something was standing outside the door. Ethan didn't want to look. He knew he couldn't look, but his body betrayed him, slowly inching toward the door, as though drawn by an invisible force. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the door frame. He knew what awaited him on the other side, but he couldn't stop himself. He couldn't stop the pull. He had to know. His hand closed around the door, slowly pushing it open just enough to peer outside. The hallway beyond was empty. The house was still. Nothing was there, except for the shadow. It was standing just at the edge of the door, barely visible, but undeniably there. Its shape was indistinct, a blur of darkness that seemed to stretch and contract like smoke. It seemed to reach out, tendrils of shadow curling toward him, pulling him in. He slammed the door shut, heart racing, mind reeling. He staggered back, but the whispering hadn't stopped. It was louder now, insistent, overwhelming. He couldn't escape it. You shouldn't be here. The voice was everywhere, surrounding him, pressing against his skull, filling his thoughts. Ethan fell to his knees, clutching his head, his breath shallow and ragged, his vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin around him. And then, everything went dark. Ethan awoke to silence. First, it was a relief. The buzzing hum of his mind quieted, the whispers fading into the recesses of his thoughts. He lay still for a long while, eyes closed, trying to gather his bearings. He wasn't sure how much time had passed since the darkness had taken him. Had it been moments, hours, days? The weight of his confusion seemed to suffocate him, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the cold, hard reality around him. His apartment was empty, unchanged. No shadow stood at the door. No figure stared at him from the corners of the room. It felt like a brief reprieve, but one he knew would not last. The unsettling sensation that something was wrong still lingered in the air, thick like smoke, making it hard to breathe. He sat up slowly, groaning as his head throbbed. The floor was colder than he remembered, his body aching from the tension he had held while locked in his fear. He glanced around, eyes darting to the VCR, the tapes lying discarded on the floor beside it. He couldn't tear his gaze away from them. It was almost like they were calling him. His stomach churned at the thought, but he knew what he had to do. He had to watch. The question gnawed at him, the question of why. Why did the tapes, the images, the voices draw him in so completely? What was it about the unseen figure in the doorway, the shadows, the whispers, that made him crave more? He didn't have the answer, but it didn't matter anymore. He couldn't escape. He could feel the pull of the tapes like a weight in his chest, dragging him down into the dark. And as much as he wanted to fight it, his hands moved of their own accord, reaching for the nearest tape. He inserted it into the VCR, the whir of the machine filling the silence. The screen flickered to life, showing a new scene, one he hadn't seen before. The image was grainy, distorted. It looked like the inside of an old house, long abandoned. Dust clung to every surface, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, as though the house had been left untouched for years. But there was something else, something in the air. The atmosphere was thick, oppressive, like the air itself had become too heavy to breathe. And in the center of the room, standing motionless, was the figure. The one he had seen on the other tapes, the one with the black eyes. But this time, the figure wasn't alone. Behind it, just barely visible in the dim light, was a child, a girl. Her face was turned away from the camera, her body hunched and still. She didn't move. She didn't make a sound. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The child looked so familiar. He couldn't place it at first, but then it hit him. The girl had been in one of the earlier tapes, too. The one with the rocking chair. The figure in the background loomed large, stretching its limbs impossibly long, its fingers curling toward the girl's head. Ethan's heart raced as he watched, unable to tear his gaze away. The room was so still, so unnaturally still. Then the figure in the background moved. It took a slow, deliberate step toward the girl, its limbs twisting and shifting like something that had no right to be human. Its eyes, those black, empty eyes, never left her. The girl didn't react. She didn't seem to notice the figure at all. She just stood there, her back hunched, her head slightly lowered. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He couldn't stop watching. His mind screamed at him to turn it off, to walk away, but his body didn't listen. The pull of the scene was overwhelming. The figure moved again, slowly, deliberately, until it was standing directly behind the girl. And then, just as it had done in the earlier tapes, the screen cut to black. Ethan jumped back, his heart leaping in his chest. He gasped for air, his hands trembling. He reached for the remote to eject the tape, but his fingers fumbled, unable to find the button. The whispering had started again. It was faint at first, just a murmur at the edge of his hearing. But it grew louder, louder still, until it was deafening. "You shouldn't be here." It was the same voice, the same whisper, but this time it felt different. The words were sharper, more insistent. It was as though the voice was angry. The air in the apartment seemed to vibrate with the sound, a low hum that made the walls feel like they were closing in on him. His vision blurred again. His head swam with dizziness, and he felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. His pulse thudded in his ears, a steady, unrelenting beat. He staggered backward, clutching at the arm of the couch for support. The door. He turned toward the door, his chest tightening. The sound was louder now, closer. The door was ajar, just slightly, and beyond it, he could see the hallway stretching out in the dim light. The shadows in the hallway seemed to be moving, slithering, like something alive. He couldn't stay here. He knew that now. He had to leave. He had to get away from the tapes, from this apartment, from Harper's Creek. But his body wouldn't cooperate. His feet felt like lead, his legs heavy, unwilling to move. The whispering continued, louder, more urgent. It wasn't just in his ears anymore. It was inside his mind, pressing against his thoughts. "You shouldn't be here." The door was open. The hallway beckoned him. It was the only way out, the only way to stop this, to stop the madness. Ethan took a step forward, his breath ragged. The floor creaked beneath him, but he didn't stop. Ethan stumbled forward, his mind a whirl of panic and confusion. The hallway stretched out before him, impossibly long, as though it was an endless tunnel of darkness. Each step he took felt like an eternity, the shadows curling around him, whispering louder with each passing moment. The figure at the end of the hall remained motionless, its form distorting with each blink of his eyes. He tried to turn back. He tried to retreat into the apartment, away from the dark, away from the hallway, but his feet wouldn't move. They were glued to the floor, as if bound by invisible chains. The walls pressed in on him, narrowing the space, pushing him forward, urging him closer to the figure. The air around him grew thicker, colder, and with every breath, it felt as though the darkness itself was suffocating him. The whispers swirled around him, a chorus of voices that he could no longer separate. They weren't speaking in words anymore, just fragmented sounds, like broken sentences repeating over and over, blending together in a maddening cacophony. "You shouldn't be here." The words were clear now, too clear. They weren't just whispers, they were commands, demands. There was a malice to the tone now, a growing anger that seemed to rise with each breath he took. The walls vibrated with the sound, the floor beneath his feet trembling, as though the house itself was alive. The figure at the end of the hall finally moved. It didn't step forward. No, the figure simply shifted. It was like a ripple in space, a distortion of reality. One moment it was standing still, and the next it was closer, closer than it had ever been. Its long, twisted limbs stretched impossibly toward him, curling like dark tendrils. Its hollow eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Ethan froze. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as it had moved, the figure stopped. It was standing right in front of him now, its grotesque form towering over him, its twisted face just inches away. The air grew colder still. He could feel the presence of the figure pressing against his chest, suffocating him, as though it was pulling the very breath from his body. The figure's face was nothing. There were no features, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, featureless surface, like a mannequin's face, bland and inhuman. Ethan couldn't look away. He couldn't stop himself from staring into the void that was the figure's face, and the longer he stared, the more he felt like he was being consumed. He reached out, his hand shaking uncontrollably, and touched the surface of the figure's face. It was cold, freezing cold, like ice, and as his fingers made contact, the world around him seemed to collapse in on itself. The hallway bent and twisted, the walls and ceiling warping as if they were made of liquid. The figure's face seemed to stretch, its smooth surface rippling, like the calm surface of water disturbed by a stone. Ethan tried to pull away, but his hand was stuck. It was as though his fingers had been glued to the figure's face, held in place by an unseen force. He screamed, but the sound was muffled, as if his voice was being swallowed by the dark. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were all he could hear. They were in his mind now, not just his ears. The voices, the words, they were inside his head, crawling through his thoughts, demanding he listen, demanding he understand. "You shouldn't be here. It's too late now." Ethan's vision blurred. The figure's face was all he could see now, its smooth, featureless surface stretching and distorting, swallowing his thoughts. The darkness around him deepened, and the hallway twisted, turning into an endless maze of distorted reflections. The walls were no longer walls. They were mirrors, showing him versions of himself that didn't make sense, showing him his face in ways that made him question whether it was truly him at all. He tried to scream again, but no sound came. And then he saw her, the girl. She stood in one of the mirrors, her back turned to him. She was no longer silent. She was muttering something, a string of nonsensical words that filled the air with a sense of unease. Her voice was soft, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but there was an edge to it, a hint of desperation. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he took a hesitant step toward her. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its featureless face locked in place, staring at nothing. The girl turned slowly, her face hidden in shadow. Her eyes were empty, hollow. And then she spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The words were soft, but they hit him like a blow to the chest. Ethan stumbled backward, his mind reeling. The hallway spun around him, the mirrors flashing in and out of existence. The whispers swirled in his head, louder now, as if they were trying to drown him. "You shouldn't be here." The girl's face, those hollow, empty eyes, stared at him unblinking as the room seemed to collapse around him. The walls were closing in. The air was thick with suffocating pressure, and the darkness was alive, pressing against his skin. Ethan's breath quickened. The figure, the girl, the whispers, everything was collapsing into a single point of overwhelming terror. He couldn't escape. There was no way out. There was no escape from this nightmare. The darkness began to swallow him whole, and as the world around him dissolved, the whispers became a scream. When Ethan opened his eyes again, he wasn't in the hallway. He wasn't in his apartment. He wasn't anywhere. He was floating. The air around him was thick, black, and suffocating. His body felt weightless, but not in the comforting way of a dream. No, this was something else. This was wrong. This wasn't sleep. This wasn't peace. This was something else entirely. He could see shapes around him, dark, shifting forms that moved just outside of his vision. He reached out, trying to touch them, but his hands passed through the shapes as if they weren't even real. And then the whispers started again. "You shouldn't be here." The words echoed in the void. They weren't just in his ears, they were inside him, in his bones, in his blood. They were part of him. He couldn't escape them. They were everywhere. He turned his head, and in the distance he saw something. A shape, a figure. It was the same figure, the one with the featureless face. It was standing in the darkness, just at the edge of his vision, watching him. Ethan tried to scream, but his voice didn't make a sound. The figure stepped forward, and then the darkness took him. Ethan felt his body collapse into the void, the sensation of falling endless and disorienting. His breath was ragged, his heart pounding in his chest, yet no sound escaped him. It was as if the very essence of reality had been stripped away, leaving only darkness to consume him. The whispers continued to swirl around him, their words indistinguishable now, a frantic, maddening chorus that filled every corner of his mind. "You shouldn't be here." He could still hear the voice clearly, as though it was right next to him, speaking into his ear with a cold, pitiless tone. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't see where it came from. The figure, the one with the featureless face, was nowhere to be found. It was as if it had dissolved into the darkness, leaving only the overwhelming presence of its absence. Ethan's pulse raced. He felt like he was drowning in the nothingness, like he was being pulled deeper into a world that was collapsing under its own weight. His mind struggled to process the isolation, the sheer emptiness that surrounded him. The air was suffocating, thick with something he couldn't name, something ancient, like it had been waiting for him all this time. His fingers trembled as they reached out into the void, hoping to grasp something, anything, to ground himself. But there was nothing, nothing solid, nothing real, just an endless expanse of blackness, stretching out in every direction, with no beginning and no end. And then something shifted. A small flicker in the distance like a far-off light. Ethan's breath hitched. Was it real? Was it a trick of his mind? He took a hesitant step toward it. His legs felt like they were moving through molasses, his body heavy with dread. The light flickered again, this time brighter, more pronounced. It was almost like a doorway, a portal that promised escape from the suffocating void. His feet carried him forward, as though he had no choice. He didn't know why, but the light seemed to call to him, pulling him in. Every step he took felt like a struggle, as though the very fabric of the universe was pushing back against him. Yet, with every painful movement, the light grew brighter, closer. And then, just as he was about to reach it, the light flickered once more, and it was gone. He froze. A cold chill washed over him. He was still alone in the void. But this time, the whispers were louder. So loud that they seemed to press against his skull, filling his mind with frantic images, flashing memories that didn't belong to him. You shouldn't be here. The voice was clearer now, sharper, like a blade slicing through his thoughts. It was all around him, inside him, until it felt like it was coming from his very soul. Ethan tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed whole by the endless blackness. There was no escape, no one to hear him. And then, something changed. He felt it before he saw it. A presence behind him, something moving in the darkness, something that wasn't supposed to be there. It was there, just beyond the edge of his perception, watching him. His heart skipped a beat, and his body tensed. He slowly turned, but there was nothing there, just the same suffocating darkness. But he could feel it. He could feel it in the air, the presence. Someone was out there, just beyond his reach, just beyond his sight. And then, the voice came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the same voice he had heard before. This one was familiar. It was soft, almost comforting. Ethan, the sound of his name, spoken softly in the void, sent a wave of nausea through him. The voice was so familiar, but it didn't belong here. Not in this place. He spun around again, his eyes scanning the darkness, but he saw nothing. No face, no figure. Ethan, don't be afraid. The voice was getting closer now, circling around him like a predator closing in on its prey. It was coming from all directions, each whisper a thread weaving itself into his consciousness. He could feel it crawling through his veins, making his skin crawl, his body shudder. I've been waiting for you. The voice was almost a caress, and yet it chilled him to his core. It was too intimate, too personal. It didn't belong here, in the emptiness. It didn't belong in his mind. He pressed his hands to his ears, desperate to block out the sound. But it was no use. The voice was inside him now, in his thoughts, in his soul. It was everything. You've been searching for answers, haven't you? Ethan's heart pounded. It was asking him questions he didn't want to answer. It was like the voice knew everything about him. Every fear, every doubt, every dark corner of his mind. It knew him better than he knew himself. You want to know why you're here? His breath caught in his throat. The words felt like a dagger, twisting deeper and deeper into his mind. Don't you? He nodded, almost involuntarily, the weight of his own uncertainty dragging him deeper into the abyss. It's not what you think. You don't understand yet, but you will. The voice continued, its tone like a lullaby, soothing and terrifying at the same time. It wasn't just speaking to him, it was becoming him. The lines between his own thoughts and the voice's words began to blur, and he felt his mind unraveling. The longer the voice spoke, the more he felt his grip on reality slipping away. "You're not supposed to be here, Ethan." The words hit him like a wave of ice-cold water, snapping him back to the present. He gasped, suddenly aware of the suffocating darkness around him once more. The voice was gone, leaving only the weight of its presence lingering in the air. Ethan's chest tightened. His thoughts were a whirlwind, spinning faster and faster until they became a blur of incoherent ideas. He couldn't think straight. He couldn't tell where the darkness ended and his mind began. His feet started moving again, but this time they were carrying him somewhere. Somewhere he didn't want to go. The whispers followed him, a constant hum at the back of his mind, urging him forward, pulling him deeper into the void. But Ethan didn't resist anymore. He couldn't. It was like he had been pulled into a current, dragged along by a force stronger than his own will. And then he saw it. The doorway. A faint outline of light appeared in the distance, barely visible against the blackness. It was the same light he had seen before, the one that had flickered and vanished. But this time it didn't fade. It remained steady, like a beacon in the void, calling him forward. Ethan moved toward it. His legs were heavy, like he was wading through water, but the light pulled him in. It was the only thing that seemed real, the only thing that offered the possibility of escape. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the light, and then everything stopped. The void disappeared. The darkness retreated, fading like a bad dream. Ethan found himself standing in a different place now. The light that had once been a distant promise now surrounded him, filling the space with a soft, golden glow. But the air was thick with tension. Something had changed. The landscape before him was unfamiliar. It was an open field, the sky a dull gray, the wind whipping through the tall grass, which bent in strange, unnatural patterns. The trees in the distance were twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was cracked, as if the earth itself had been scarred by some unspoken force. And then, at the far edge of the field, he saw it. A figure stood motionless, its back to him. The air around it shimmered, as though reality itself was bending in its presence. Ethan couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the ground, his body frozen in place, as if some unseen force held him in check. And then the figure turned. It wasn't the same figure from before. No, this one was different. Its face was covered by a veil, but Ethan could feel its eyes on him. The weight of its gaze pressed into his skull, as if it were reading his thoughts, peeling away the layers of his mind. He couldn't look away, couldn't tear his gaze from the figure. "You're too late," the figure said, its voice familiar, but colder than anything he had ever heard. Ethan's chest tightened, his heart raced, and then the world began to fold in on itself again. The void disappeared. The darkness retreated, fading like a bad dream. Ethan found himself standing in a different place now. The light that had once been a distant promise now surrounded him, filling the space with a soft, golden glow. But the air was thick with tension. Something had changed. The landscape before him was unfamiliar. It was an open field, the sky a dull gray, the wind whipping through the tall grass, which bent in strange, unnatural patterns. The trees in the distance were twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was cracked, as if the earth itself had been scarred by some unspoken force. And then, at the far edge of the field, he saw it. A figure stood motionless, its back to him. The air around it shimmered, as though reality itself was bending in its presence. Ethan couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the ground, his body frozen in place, as if some unseen force held him in check. And then the figure turned. It wasn't the same figure from before. No, this one was different. Its face was covered by a veil, but Ethan could feel its eyes on him. The weight of its gaze pressed into his skull, as if it were reading his thoughts, peeling away the layers of his mind. He couldn't look away, couldn't tear his gaze from the figure. "You're too late," the figure said, its voice familiar, but colder than anything he had ever heard. Ethan's chest tightened, his heart raced, and then the world began to fold in on itself again. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he stood in the center of the strange, warped field. The air around him pulsed, heavy with tension. Every breath he took seemed to be sucked out of his body before he could fully inhale. The shimmering figure, the one with the veiled face, stood still, its presence suffocating, yet oddly soothing. The tension between them grew palpable, an electric charge that made the very air feel alive. "You're too late," the voice echoed again, as cold and empty as the space around them. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, their meanings slowly worming their way into his thoughts. Too late? Too late for what? Ethan's mind spun. He didn't know where he was, or how he had gotten here. The very nature of his existence felt fragile, like a thread that could snap with the slightest pull. His legs felt weak, unsteady, but he couldn't look away from the figure. His entire being seemed drawn to it, as if it held the answers to everything. Answers he hadn't even realized he was searching for. The figure took a step toward him, its movements slow and deliberate. It was as if the world itself bent around it, the air warping with each shift. Ethan's body screamed to flee, but his feet remained rooted to the ground. The closer the figure got, the heavier the silence became. Every step it took sounded like a distant echo of something far darker, far older than anything Ethan could comprehend. Finally, the figure stopped before him, just close enough that Ethan could see the faint outline of its veiled face. It was then that he noticed something strange. There was something about the veil, something faintly familiar. His mind raced to make sense of it. "You know me?" the voice whispered, sending a shiver down his spine. It was no longer cold or distant. This voice was intimate, felt like a part of him, like it was speaking from within his own mind. Ethan's pulse quickened as the figure slowly raised its hands, lifting the veil just slightly. His heart skipped a beat. There was something about the face, a shadowy outline beneath the veil, but he couldn't make it out. The face wasn't just unfamiliar. It was wrong, distorted in a way that made Ethan's stomach churn. His breath caught in his throat as a chilling realization settled over him. He did know this face. He had seen it before. The figure spoke again, and the words felt like a memory he had long buried. "You remember, don't you?" Ethan's mind reeled. He tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming, flooding him with fragmented images of a past he had long forgotten. A house, family, a woman's voice calling his name. It was all there, hidden deep in his subconscious, waiting for him to remember. "You can't hide from it forever," the figure whispered, its voice growing sharper, more insistent. "You can't run from the truth." Ethan stumbled backward, his breath ragged. The memories surged forward, flooding his mind with images of his childhood, of his parents, of a house that no longer existed. The world around him began to spin as the memories merged with his present reality, blending together in a dizzying whirl of faces and places he could no longer place. The house was dark, empty. His parents, no, not just his parents, his family were gone. His childhood home was abandoned, but the memories lingered. The whispers, the shadows, The thing that had been waiting for him, watching him all these years. And then the face that haunted his dreams. The figure before him, its veiled face, was no longer a stranger. It was her, the woman, the one who had always been there, lurking in the shadows of his mind, waiting for the moment when he would finally remember. You remember now, don't you? The figure's voice was almost a whisper now, so close that Ethan could feel it in his very soul. Ethan's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He had never escaped. The darkness, the fear, the isolation. It had all been there from the very beginning. He had tried to bury it, to run from it, but it had followed him all this time. His memories weren't just fragmented images. They were the truth. The darkness had always been a part of him, and it was time to face it. But what was the truth? What was he supposed to understand? The figure slowly lowered its veil, and Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The face was his, a twisted version of himself, pale and broken, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare into his very soul. It was him, but it wasn't. This was the version of him that had been buried, the one that had never escaped. You never left, Ethan. You never will. The words echoed in his mind, louder now, consuming him from the inside out. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His vision blurred, the edges of reality flickering like a dying light. The figure's face morphed, its features shifting, becoming a grotesque mirror of Ethan's own. "You are me," it whispered, the voice now a perfect echo of his own. Ethan closed his eyes, trying to block it all out, but the image of the twisted face remained burned into his mind. The truth of it, the undeniable horror. He had always been trapped in this nightmare. It had never stopped. It had never let go. And as the whispers grew louder, the world around him began to twist and warp, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. The darkness closed in, swallowing him whole. The abyss stretched before Ethan, an endless void, swallowing all light and sound. His steps felt as though they were being drawn by an invisible current, pulling him forward with an almost magnetic force. He wanted to scream, to fight, but the words were trapped inside his mind, like they didn't belong to him anymore. He was no longer in control of his own body. His movements were mechanical, each step closer to the precipice, each heartbeat louder in his chest. "You have to fall, Ethan," the voice repeated, its tone now warm and coaxing. "It's the only way." The closer he came to the edge, the more the abyss seemed to stir. He could feel the darkness alive, swirling, reaching up toward him like a living entity, eager to consume him. His legs trembled, the weight of the world pushing down on him as though the ground itself was bending beneath the pressure of what was to come. "Fight, fight, fight." The words echoed in his mind, growing louder with each passing second. Somewhere deep inside him, buried beneath layers of fear and despair, there was a spark, a tiny, fragile flame of resistance. He didn't know where it had come from, but it was there, flickering in the dark recesses of his mind. It was all he had left. He dug deep, reaching into the recesses of his own soul, calling upon that last shred of strength. He could fight. He could resist. He stopped, just a few feet from the abyss, his body trembling with the effort of holding himself in place. The world around him began to distort, the edges of reality bending like a melting photograph. His vision blurred as the figure's voice came again. But this time, it was different. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a demand, cold and forceful. "Let go, Ethan. Let go of the past. Let go of the fear. Let go of everything. The ground beneath him cracked open, the earth splitting wide as a dark, shadowy hand shot up from the abyss, reaching for him. The fingers were long and skeletal, curling around his ankles, dragging him closer to the edge. Ethan tried to pull away, but his body felt heavy, his limbs weak. The force was too strong. "You are me," the voice repeated, now deep and guttural, the words vibrating through his entire being. "You cannot escape yourself." Ethan's heart thudded in his chest as he struggled against the grip, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, memories, and fragmented images. His childhood home, the woman, the darkness that had always been with him, the figure, it was him. It was him. The realization struck him with the force of a lightning bolt. He was not running from something external. He was running from himself, from the version of himself he had buried all those years ago. The twisted version, the one who had never let go. This is it, he realized. This is my reckoning. The hand from the abyss tightened its grip, dragging him closer to the void. His legs kicked helplessly, and his arms flailed, but there was nothing he could do. He was slipping. Then, in a final act of defiance, Ethan reached deep inside himself. His hand, trembling with fear, found purchase on the jagged ground beneath him. He clung to it with all his might, his fingers digging into the earth. His breath came in ragged gasps as the abyss loomed closer, but something deep within him refused to let go. "I'm not you," he whispered, his voice raw and strained. "I'm not you." The words came out weak, but they felt like a revelation, a small spark of clarity in the midst of the darkness. He wasn't this twisted reflection of himself. He wasn't the broken version that the abyss wanted him to be. He was something more. The hand from the void recoiled, as if recoiling from the truth, and Ethan found a surge of strength he didn't know he had. He pulled himself back, inch by inch by inch, until his body was free of the abyss's grasp. The force of the pull had left him breathless, but his mind was clearer now, the fog lifting just a little. Ethan pulled himself to his feet, stumbling, his body shaking from the exertion. The figure, his twisted reflection, loomed before him, its veiled face now completely uncovered. It was no longer just a face, it was a distorted mockery of his own. The eyes, hollow and empty, stared at him with an expression of bitter disappointment. "You cannot escape, Ethan. You can never escape the truth." Ethan's chest tightened as he stared into the abyss. It called to him, its darkness and all-consuming void, promised an end, a release. But now he understood that it wasn't an escape. It was an illusion, the trap. "I won't let you win," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking but resolute. With a final, desperate act, he pushed forward, moving away from the abyss and the figure that mirrored his own worst fears. As he moved, the world seemed to shift, the shadows creeping back into the corners of his mind. The memories, fragments of his past, his mistakes, his failures, all clamored for attention, but Ethan refused to listen. He had faced the truth, and now he had to face the future. He took one step after another, moving farther from the abyss, farther from the figure. His heart was still racing, but the weight on his shoulders began to lighten, just a little. And then, with the smallest glimmer of hope, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. Ethan awoke. It wasn't the shock of the moment that startled him, but the strange sense of clarity that had settled over him. His eyes opened, blinking against the dim light of his room. The air felt different, as if it had been cleansed. He wasn't sure if he had imagined the abyss, the figure, or the struggle, but he could feel the remnants of it, like echoes of a distant dream. The fear had receded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt still. The room was quiet. The familiar hum of the city outside filtered through the walls, but it didn't feel oppressive anymore. It was just sound. He was no longer trapped in his own mind, no longer bound by the endless spiral of fear and self-doubt. But as he sat up, the last remnants of the figure's voice whispered in his ear, soft and distant. "You cannot outrun the truth, Ethan." Ethan turned, scanning the room, but there was nothing there. No figure, no abyss, just the soft light of the morning creeping through the curtains. But he knew deep down that he was not truly free. The abyss, the darkness, it would always be there, lurking in the corners of his mind. But for now, he was no longer its prisoner. He had faced it, and that, he realized, was all he could do. Ethan stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. The streets were bustling with life, with people going about their daily routines. The sun was shining, casting a warm glow over everything. But there was still a chill in the air, a reminder that the darkness was never truly gone. It wasn't a victory. He hadn't won, but he had survived. And sometimes that was enough. As he stared into the distance, he knew the journey wasn't over. The abyss would always be there, waiting. But so would he, fighting to keep his mind intact, to keep moving forward, no matter how dark the road ahead might be. And in that quiet moment, with the sounds of the world around him, Ethan understood that he had made it through the hardest part. The true struggle was not with the darkness that loomed outside, but with the darkness within. The battle was over for now, but tomorrow it would begin again. Ethan had hoped, fleetingly, that his mind had finally returned to some semblance of normalcy. But even as he settled back into his daily life, a nagging sensation lingered. The air still felt thick, like something unseen was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. He thought he'd outrun the darkness, that the voice, the figure, and the abyss had been left behind. But every time he closed his eyes, every time he found himself alone, he could feel it creeping in from the corners of his mind. It wasn't enough to simply be free from the physical grasp of the figure. No, this was deeper. The true prison was within, buried in his memories, in his very thoughts. The figure wasn't an external force. It was a part of him, the twisted reflection of his own mind, the dark recesses of a past he had long buried. And now that darkness was beginning to leak out once more. Ethan couldn't escape it. The sound of his breath became a constant reminder of his fragile existence. Every inhale and exhale feeling like a countdown. A reminder that the truth, whatever it was always just a heartbeat away. And then the nightmares returned. At first, they were subtle. A shadow darting at the edge of his vision. A whisper that could have been his own voice. But as the nights wore on, the nightmares grew more vivid, more intense. He would wake, drenched in sweat, heart racing, but the fear never truly left. It clung to him like a second skin. In these moments, Ethan realized something crucial. It wasn't the figure that had haunted him all these years. It was the silence, the deep, unnerving silence that followed. It was the loneliness that gnawed at his soul, the absence of anything to anchor him to reality. And soon the whispers started again. At first they were distant, barely audible, as if coming from the walls themselves. Ethan tried to ignore them, but they grew louder, clearer, as if someone or something was standing just behind him, waiting for him to turn around. "You can't escape, Ethan," the voice taunted, familiar yet alien. "You're already lost." Ethan froze, the blood draining from his face. He spun around, but the room was empty. The walls were bare, the light from the window casting long shadows across the floor. No figure, no presence, just the oppressive stillness of the night. But he could hear it now, unmistakable, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something terrible. "You've always known it, haven't you?" the voice murmured. "You're nothing without the darkness." He stumbled backward, shaking his head. The walls closed in. The shadows grew longer, darker, as if they were reaching toward him. The air felt thick, suffocating, and for a moment, Ethan thought he might suffocate under the weight of it all. And then the silence came crashing down, deafening, suffocating him from every direction. He gasped for air, clutching at his chest, but the breath wouldn't come. His vision blurred, the world spinning in dizzying circles. It was all too much, too real. "Stop." He didn't know if the words came from him or from somewhere else, but they broke through the suffocating pressure, just for a moment. And in that instant, he realized what he had been denying. The truth was always there. The abyss, the darkness, had never been an external force. It had always been within him. It was his mind, his fears, his unspoken memories. He had buried them deep, but they had never truly gone away. "You can't hide forever," the voice echoed once more. "It will always be there." Ethan closed his eyes, the weight of the words pressing down on him like a physical force. The figure had always been a reflection of himself, a representation of everything he had tried to forget. And now, as he stood there, surrounded by the shadows of his mind, he realized the horrifying truth. He couldn't escape himself. The room began to warp, the walls pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. His breath came in shallow gasps, and the shadows seemed to stretch out, reaching toward him like the hands of some unseen force. It was no longer just a nightmare. It was reality, slowly folding in on itself. In that moment, he understood. The figure wasn't just something he feared. It was his own mind, pulling him back into the abyss, reminding him that he could never escape, that the darkness, the isolation, was all he had ever known. And for a brief, fleeting moment, Ethan felt something that made his heart sink deeper than ever before. He wanted to give in. Days passed, weeks perhaps. Time had no meaning anymore. It felt like a blur, a constant cycle of nightmares and fleeting moments of wakefulness. Ethan's world had become a twisted reflection of itself. He wasn't sure what was real anymore. His mind was a maze and he was trapped inside. The whispers never stopped. They followed him everywhere. At work, in his apartment, on the streets. Each word was a seed, planting doubt and fear in his mind, slowly pulling him deeper into the spiraling abyss. They were always there, just on the edge of his consciousness, just loud enough to make him question everything he thought he knew. "You're failing," the voice would whisper. "You can't fight it. You're nothing without it." Ethan had stopped trying to make sense of it. There was no point anymore. He had tried to outrun it, tried to shut it out. But now he realized it was part of him, as much a part of him as his own thoughts, his own memories. It wasn't just the figure. It wasn't just the abyss. It was the endless cycle of doubt, the nagging feeling that he was somehow never enough. He had been running from himself for so long, and now there was no escaping it. As he wandered through his days and a daze, his mind slipping further and further into chaos, he found himself standing in front of a mirror one evening, staring at his reflection. For the first time, he didn't recognize the person staring back at him. The face was his, but it wasn't. The eyes were hollow, the skin pale, as though the life had been drained from him. It was the face of a man who had given up, a man who had stopped fighting. "This is what you are," the voice whispered in his ear. "This is what you've always been." And in that moment, Ethan realized that the true horror was not the figure, not the abyss, but the realization that he had always been this broken version of himself. The darkness wasn't something external, something that could be fought or escaped. It was a part of him woven into the fabric of his very being. The voice was right. There was no escaping it. Ethan walked through the streets in a trance, his mind numb, his body moving on its own. The world around him seemed distant, unreal. He didn't feel anything. He didn't care. The shadows followed him, stretching long and dark across the ground. He could feel the weight of them, pressing against him, pulling at him. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. "You're nothing without me," the voice hissed. "You've always been mine." Ethan didn't resist. He didn't want to resist. He felt nothing, just an overwhelming numbness, as though he had finally surrendered to the inevitable. The darkness had claimed him, and there was no turning back. As the whispers echoed in his mind, he felt a strange calm settle over him. The figure, his reflection, was no longer a threat. It was him, and the abyss, it was the only place left where he could finally find peace. The city blurred around him as he stepped into the dark alley, the cold night air brushing against his skin. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan closed his eyes, letting the darkness consume him completely. The end had come. As Ethan closed his eyes, the world around him dissolved. The sounds of the city, the whispers, the shadows, all faded into an oppressive silence. It wasn't like sleep. It wasn't like death either. It was something in between, a state where time no longer mattered, where nothing moved but the slow, steady beat of his heart. In that silence, there was a strange comfort. No expectations, no pressure. Just the quiet, endless abyss stretching out before him. The figure, the voice, it was all gone now, or rather, it had become part of him. The boundary between them had blurred until it ceased to exist. He wasn't fighting anymore, nor was he running. There was nothing left to fight. The coldness of the alleyway, the oppressive weight of the world, it all disappeared. For a fleeting moment, Ethan thought he could breathe again. But that moment was gone just as quickly as it came. The abyss was infinite. The shadows within the alley no longer seemed threatening. They had become a part of him too, an extension of the dark thoughts and feelings that had always simmered below the surface. They were no longer foreign or frightening. They were home. Ethan could feel it. A slow embrace, the quiet pull of the darkness. He could feel his body growing heavier, as though the very air around him was thickening, pressing down with gentle force. It was almost soothing, the weight of it, as if everything he had been through, every fear, every mistake, every fight had finally come to an end. He didn't struggle. He didn't resist. For the first time in a long time, Ethan let go. When Ethan opened his eyes again, he wasn't in the alley anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere cold and dark, but familiar. The walls around him were high, towering into the darkness above. The space was wide and echoing, empty, and yet there was a feeling of presence, a sense that he was not truly alone. He tried to move but found his limbs stiff, as though frozen in place. The air was thick and suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on his chest, forcing the breath out of him with every attempt to inhale. There was a strange buzzing in his ears, distant but growing louder. His heartbeat quickened, but there was no escaping the suffocating stillness. For a moment, panic bubbled to the surface. He tried to scream, but no sound came. He was trapped, paralyzed in this strange place. But as the seconds stretched into what felt like eternity, the initial shock began to wear off. Ethan looked around, straining against the stillness, his mind still heavy with the remnants of the abyss. It didn't take long for him to realize where he was. This place, it was his mind, the vast, endless labyrinth of his own psyche. The dark corridors, the towering walls, the coldness in the air. It was all familiar. A place he had visited before in his nightmares. A place he had always tried to escape. But now there was no escape. This was where the figure had come from. This was where his darkness had been born. The truth was clear now, staring him in the face. He was the creator of this darkness. The realization hit him like a wave, pulling him under. He had always thought the abyss was something outside of him, a force that had overtaken him. But it wasn't. It had been him all along. The thoughts, the fears, the desires. It was all born from his mind. He had created this place, this prison, with every lie he had ever told himself, every fear he had buried deep inside. The figure was a reflection of that, a manifestation of everything he had tried to avoid. He had never escaped. Ethan sat down on the cold floor, his head in his hands, overwhelmed by the weight of the truth. This was his prison, his creation, and now it was all he had left. The shadows around him began to stir, swirling in the corners of his mind. They had always been with him, feeding off his insecurities, his doubts. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. "You cannot escape the truth, Ethan." His heart raced. The words felt different now, not threatening, not accusing, but familiar, like an old friend that had never truly left. The voice wasn't an external force. It was him. It always had been. He looked up, his eyes scanning the empty space around him. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing closer. But it wasn't terrifying anymore. It wasn't an abyss. It was just space, a void, a place where he had been all along. And now he was ready to accept it. "Let go," the voice whispered, softer now, almost comforting. "Let go of the fight." Ethan closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his body in that one breath. For the first time, he felt peace. Not the peace of escape, but the peace of acceptance. He wasn't running from the darkness anymore. He was sitting with it. He had created it, and now he was learning to live with it. The days passed, or perhaps they didn't. Time no longer had meaning in this place. The shadows continued to swirl, shifting and moving in the corners of his vision. But Ethan no longer tried to chase them away. He watched them with a quiet calm, accepting their presence, understanding that they were a part of him. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't a defeat. It was simply existence. Ethan's mind had unraveled, but in that unraveling, he had found something he hadn't expected. The darkness wasn't a monster to be fought. It wasn't something to be afraid of. It was simply a part of him, a reflection of his own fears and desires. He didn't know if he would ever leave this place, this prison of his own making. He didn't know if he even wanted to. The voices, the figure, they had faded. The abyss had become just another shadow in his mind, a part of the landscape he had created. And as the hours turned into days, and the days into weeks, Ethan sat in the stillness, waiting for the next cycle to begin, waiting for the next moment of clarity. The truth was simple. He would never truly escape. And yet, somehow, that was enough. Somewhere deep in the labyrinth of his mind, a door stood open. It wasn't the way out, there was no way out, but it was a door nonetheless. Through it, Ethan could see the world, or at least his perception of it. It was a world of constant motion, of life and death, of love and loss. A world where people moved through the days, chasing their own shadows, never realizing the truth, that they were all trapped, just like him. He could hear their voices now, the people from his past, the ones he had tried to forget. Their whispers mingled with the shadows, the echo of their lives reverberating through the corridors of his mind. "You're not alone," the voice whispered. "You never were." And in that moment, Ethan realized the truth wasn't about escaping. It was about living with it. The cycle, the abyss, the figure, it was all part of the same web. A web he had created, yes, but one that was also woven through every other person, every other mind. We are all trapped, Ethan thought, but we are also free. And as the echoes of the world outside reverberated through his mind, Ethan sat back, letting the darkness settle around him like a blanket, knowing that he would never escape, but also knowing that, perhaps, that was okay. Time no longer mattered. Ethan's world had become a quiet place, a place where the shadows were no longer enemies, but companions. He had learned to live with them, to embrace them, to accept them as part of himself. And in that quiet, he found peace. Not the peace of victory, but the peace of acceptance. The story ends here, in the stillness, where Ethan's journey has come full circle. There is no final moment of triumph, no final confrontation with the abyss. There is only the quiet hum of existence, the acceptance of what is. And in that acceptance, there is freedom. Time, or what was left of it, no longer mattered. Ethan had long since lost track of the days, the hours, the minutes. His reality had warped into something unrecognizable. A place where existence was no longer measured in moments, but in the slow, rhythmic passage of his thoughts. He no longer struggled to escape. There was no more fight left in him. The darkness, once his greatest adversary, had become a constant companion, not one to dread, but one to coexist with. It was always there in the periphery, lurking at the edges of his consciousness, but now it was simply accepted. In the quiet of his mind, Ethan found an odd kind of peace. The whispers, once insistent and cruel, had softened, becoming a steady hum, a reminder of his fractured self, a murmur of the abyss that had swallowed him whole. He no longer sought to silence it. He had stopped running. The shadows, once terrifying and all-consuming, were no longer his enemies. They had become part of him, and he, in turn, had become part of them. There was a stillness now, a deep and pervasive silence that filled every corner of his existence. He was not happy. He was not sad. He was not angry. He simply was. Ethan sat in the dark, feeling the weight of his thoughts, the weight of his choices. He had accepted his reality, as twisted as it had become. The figure, the voice, the abyss. They were not separate entities, not forces from the outside that had tormented him. They were fragments of himself, reflections of his deepest fears and darkest desires. He had given them life by denying them, by fighting against them. Now that he had stopped resisting, they no longer seemed so monstrous. The room around him was still, cold, and dark. He could hear the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath him, the faint rustling of something in the air, the familiar hum of the world, as distant as it seemed, was still there. Somewhere far beyond the walls of his mind, people lived their lives, unaware of the strange, twisted labyrinth that Ethan now occupied. He imagined them, each person going about their day, chasing their own shadows, caught in their own labyrinths. They too, he thought, were running, though perhaps they didn't even know it. For the first time in what felt like ages, Ethan stood up. His legs wobbled slightly, as though they weren't used to movement anymore. His body felt numb, disconnected from the mind that had held it captive for so long. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the corners where the shadows still danced, alive with the quiet energy of his mind. The silence settled around him again, and for a moment, he allowed himself to simply exist in it. There was no need for answers anymore. There was no need for resolution. His mind, for all its chaos and disorder, had finally stilled. Ethan knew this was not the end of the darkness. It would never end. It would never be defeated. It was a part of him, a piece of his soul that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. And now that he had accepted it, now that he had allowed it to become part of the whole, it no longer felt like something to fear. The darkness was his and he was its, and that was enough.